Well, I want to thank the Heinrich Boll Foundation for the opportunity to share my thoughts about the commons, for building a new type of economy, for helping to deal with climate change, but most of all, for helping to reconfigure our social relationships with each other and for our dealings with the earth. Now, where to begin? This is such a huge topic and there's so much that could be said, but let me try to give you a 10 or 15 minute version of how I think the commons can help us reconceptualize the social relationships that we otherwise know as the economy and build a different system of value. Now, this requires change at a very basic elemental level of life, not just the superstructures of power and the institutions and well, not just the superstructures of power, but also the institutions and habits of thought that we have, and our social practices and culture, and indeed our own inner lives in a way need to be changed and transformed along the way. So let me start by saying that we need to approach the commons as commoning. The commons as a verb, not a noun. And I think this holds the key to understanding how commons actually work, because commons are a social process, not a resource. Now, economists and politicians generally regard the commons as unowned, potentially shareable resources like outer space or the internet or oceans and so forth. And they presume that this shared wealth will be destroyed in a so-called tragedy of the commons, which is reckless overexploitation and ruin, unless private property or government step in to manage the resource. And the presumption is that only the market or the state can successfully produce things or govern them. And let me just get show my slides to help illustrate some of the points I'd like to make in my talk. The market state system usually misunderstands or fails to see the commons as a significant factor in the world. But we're beginning to see that standard economics and its idea of markets has its own limitations and what you might say externalities that don't fit within the standard economic narrative. As we saw a few months ago, and we see during the pandemic, global supply chains are tremendously fragile, costly, and economically harmful. And this is something that we have to deal with going forward, especially in the context of climate change. But if the history of the commons shows anything, it's that commoning itself can be a highly stable form of governance, and that it's highly generative. It creates value, and it embodies a different worldview and mindset than the one that is generally put forward by standard economics. Now, to be clear, as you can see, the market enclosures and ILF are becoming just worse and worse. But to be clear, a commons is not just a resource, it's a social system of commoning. It's the community plus the resource plus the norms and social practices that it uses. And this is something that my colleague Silke Helferich and I tried to outline in our book and understand better about how commons work on the inside. We published this book, Free, Fair, and Alive, The Insurgent Power of the Commons in 2019, and I'm thrilled that it's now available in Spanish. And I would like to thank the guerrilla media translation people in Spain for assisting this process and helping to find publishers in Latin America to help distribute it. And we wanted to understand how the social dynamics of commons work, no matter what type of resource they may revolve around. So first, let me give you an idea of kind of the range of commons out there. Commons really arise everywhere and anywhere. You could say that it's kind of the default mode of organizing production and governance throughout human history. It's the past 200 years that have been something of an aberration with the rise of industrial markets in the state. And to give you an idea, there's an estimated 2 billion people in rural regions of the world that depend upon commons of forests, fisheries, irrigation water, and other natural systems for their everyday subsistence. But these actual commons are often patronized or dismissed by standard economists because there's no money changing hands. And so how could it possibly be interesting or useful? Now, commons are not just in the southern nations of the world, they're also in the global north, but of course with different social practices and cultural norms that drive them. Many communities are embracing agroecology and permaculture and the principles of slow food and community land trusts and other types of relocalized food systems, which don't have many of the pathologies of big agriculture. And many of these projects succeed by removing land from speculative markets to decommodify the land and make it more economically feasible to grow higher quality food, organic food, local food, pay better wages for workers without the kinds of overhead costs that industrial agriculture has. Now, a big part of commoning is also about building shared infrastructures for shared benefit. And we see this in something like the traditional irrigation water systems of New Mexico, the acequias. And we see it in the GuiFi-Net Wi-Fi system in Catalonia, Spain, which lets people have high quality, low cost bandwidth, broadband run as a commons. Now, around the world, similarly, we see alternative currencies functioning as a kind of money infrastructure to capture and recirculate value within their regions, preventing big finance from siphoning it away. There are all sorts of non-capitalist forms of finance that pools money from within communities rather than making people hostage to debt and equity in the traditional capitalist way. So examples are things like crowd equity and gifting projects and place-based lending and time banking service barter systems. Now, people are often able to escape the capitalist imperatives of the world through knowledge commons. The World Wide Web is amassing hosting infrastructure for all sorts of knowledge commons. It's not just Twitter and Facebook and Google. There are all sorts of commons that are very functional and doing a lot of valuable stuff. Creative Commons licenses have enabled this by allowing documents and film and photos and music to be legally shareable through copyright-based licenses that allow copyright holders to say this can be shared. In a particular interest is open source software and a new generation of things based on open source knowledge, which is called cosmo-local production, where people share design and knowledge on a global scale, but then produce physical things locally, like farm equipment and electronic circuit boards or even motor vehicles and cars. And fab labs are part of this process. Now, I could go on about this, but my point is that commoning is happening everywhere, all sorts of places, and it happens even though the dominant system is not giving its permission. We can really start to build a parallel social economy now based on rich collective wisdom and a sense of fairness. And it's based on distributed power, not centralized market power or capital. And it's built on dense social relationships of trust that create stability and yet flexibility. Now, this economy thrives because it has rapid feedback loops that create better, more timely kinds of knowledge and ecological feedback. And it's based on stewardship of value that's not priced or traded. Now, this helps avoid market-driven overuse of resources, which is arguably one of our biggest problems today, contributing to climate change. And many system change movements share these general goals of the commons, such as the movements for degrowth, for cooperatives, the solidarity economy, the transition town movement, indigenous peoples movements, and some of the ones I just mentioned a moment ago. When my colleague Silke Helferich and I were researching our book, Free, Fair, and Alive, we slowly came to realize that the standard economic discourse just does not accurately describe what is going on in a commons. we realize that commons are actually living social systems and not primarily a matter of resource management. Of course, even though, of course, things do need to be skillfully managed, but it's more about the social relationships among people that we need to pay attention to. And this cuts across sectors, whether the resource is digital code or land or water or forests or urban spaces. Now, the social process, the commoning, therefore, is what we regard as there's a social life to it, there's provisioning, or what is often called production, but unfortunately production is so often linked to consumption that we wanted to talk about provisioning, it's self-provisioning. And then there's a peer governance that manages this. And Silke and I decided that these three aspects of interrelated patterns of commoning should be called the triad of commoning as a way to help understand how all of them contribute to a successful commons. And we started to realize that a commons is not about rational actors who are engaging in these prisoner dilemma scenarios to maximize their individual well-being and output. It's more about aligning individual and collective interests and needs together. And we wanted to make clear that commoning occurs outside of the neoclassical capitalist mindset. It enacts a different set of human attitudes and behaviors than the rational economic man that you'll often hear about. So to truly recognize what's going on in the commons, you need to achieve what we call an onto shift or an ontological shift away from standard economics, meaning you have to have a different sense of social reality and existence. It's not just individuals, it's the collective as well. It's not just this part of the system, it's the entire system and how we're nested within it. And we had to create some vocabulary to describe this, such as not just resources, which implies commodity or something you can put a price on, but care wealth, something that's about our identity and our cultural affiliations with each other. And not just rational man, as if it's rational to destroy nature, but something that we call Ubuntu rationality, which is an indigenous term in South Africa for I am because we are, meaning there's collective integration of people. So these are the kinds of shifts of perspective and language that we think are really important for understanding commons, to realize that the world is not about self-made individualists and expansive private property and constant economic growth. These are really more a source of a problem than a solution. Really, we have to talk about cultivating a sense of common purpose and meaning, and about the stewardship of shared wealth, whether it's software code or forests or fisheries or urban spaces or alternative currencies. So in a commons, you're cultivating a different worldview, and you're getting beyond the separations that the modern state and modern economics imposes on us, the separation of humanity from nature, the separation of production from governance, and the separation of individuals from collectives. There's a lot of artificial separations and dichotomies going on. So seen from this perspective, the commons is not just about small-scale projects on the periphery of the market state system. It's really the seed version or vision for reinventing some fundamental premises of economics, of governance, of politics, of organizational life, of infrastructure, and of state power itself. And most notably, it represents a different theory of value. You have to see that commons are value creating. Feminist economics often use this iceberg image to show that there's an enormous amount of value that is created outside of the formal economy and money transactions. And as you can see, most of life itself exists outside of markets, although economics and businesses, of course, are keenly focused on how to monetize or marketize this external life. But even though it's still emerging, the commons verse represents a parallel economy. It's a richer collective wisdom that is manifest in it, with, as I mentioned, the trustworthy feedback loops, and it's a distributed power as opposed to a centralized power concentrated in companies or the state. And it's based on a different type of social relationship of mutual aid and cooperation and overlapping responsibilities among people. And care, especially as described in a lot of feminist economic literature, is a key element for making commons run. So these are the kinds of themes that Silke Helfrich and I laid out in our book, Free, Fair, and Alive, The Insurgent Power of the Commons, which we regard as a new conceptualization of the commons and the principles, the principles and social patterns that make it go. And let me just add that I've recently published another book that is kind of a complement to Free, Fair, and Alive. It's called The Commoners Catalog for Changemaking. It came out in January. And it's about showing the breadth and liveliness of commons projects and movements around the world. It contains dozens of examples in about 25 thematic categories. It's available as a printed book, but it's also available for free online at www.commonerscatalog.org. So I hope these two books will help promote a larger understanding of the commons, and I really appreciate this opportunity to share my thoughts on the topic.